The Spider's Bird. My storytelling begins from Ananse, the Akan collective noun for Ananse stories. Often when people hear that reference, they think of it in terms of trickery, because of Kwaku Ananse's history of guile that has traveled the world through the transatlantic slave trade, morphing into folklore via new names. Bre Ananse, Ananse, Compananzi, as he settled in Suriname, Jamaica, the USA, Curaçao, and other parts of the exploited world. However, in my case, the inspiration comes from the philosophy of telling Ananse Sem, as I was told them as a boy. I was struck by the way the teller would ask for names and responses to questions and incorporate them into the story, as if the story were responsive to its audience, rather than a ready-made world they had to learn to inhabit. The point of departure for my novel, Tale of the Bluebird, is exactly that. A bird is living its life. If you let it be, the world continues to turn. If you insert yourself into its world, reality changes. The story changes just the way the Ananse stories I was told altered with my input. The birds have never stopped singing. If you look, you will see that whatever happens, the birds will sing their song. It is a starting point fueled by humility, and that attitude informs everything else in the novel. No worldview can assume superiority. It can only answer questions or not. Interestingly, in the editing process, my open-ended conclusion was challenged until I revealed that I am myself a Western-trained scientist. I was very deliberate in my choice. What that editorial hesitation illustrated to me is that a West-centric logical approach to story structure is so ingrained that to not assert it is considered a challenge to its primacy. So the novel's posture, its willingness to be in conversation, is its first protest. I am story, not theory, not a rationale. The responsive, conversational heritage from Ananse goes on to inspire the rest of the novel. What if what the city considers a crime is not recognized as a crime in the village? What if the village were a character in the conversation? I wanted the experience of reading the novel to be akin to the power of the proverbs that often sum up Ananse stories. For me, the African proverb is the ultimate eternal conversation. Where Western thought has rooted itself in theorems and laws, the village of Sonokrom in Tale of the Bluebird is rooted in proverbs. Proverbs maintain the village's conversation with the world because they have no obsession with an ultimate version of events. The proverb's meaning unravels according to individual experience. Let me give an example. We can sum up Newton's law of universal gravitation by saying that two objects attract each other less when they are far from each other and more when they are near, and bigger objects have stronger attraction. Now, if we take that to the apple and the earth, as the earth is bigger than anything on it, it has more pull than any apple, person, or object on it. So we all fall downwards. And the physicist could calculate the speed of your fall from your weight, except it also depends on your shape, except it also depends on what you're wearing, except it depends on wind resistance. It could go on forever. So we are only usually told the first part, and science retains its authority to speak, or not. Proverb would summarize the whole thing by saying, how you fall depends on what you fall into, or something along those lines. It is easy for some observer with no grounding in the culture to dismiss it as a quirky local saying, but those who know will tell you that based on your experience, it could mean so many things. Someone who has fallen on hard times and been bailed out by a friend might say, that's why the elders say how you fall depends on what you fall into. A kid that trips and ends up in a patch of grass instead of the concrete slab adjacent might say the same thing. A reflective student, hearing Newton's law for the first time, might also make the connection. That is the power of the proverb. Its very nature giving it an inherently wider currency in human experience than the didactic posture of theories that emerge from what we have come to know as the Age of Enlightenment. Also presented as a conversation rather than a clash, as is often the case in Western narratives, is the gap between the city and the village. Those of us with hybrid heritage have always known that we don't feel any loud clashes in our bellies as we walk the street. We are not torn or confused. We simply know the way in more ways than people who claim a single heritage. In the same way, people in the city carry elements of the village and vice versa. Keo, one of the protagonists, for example, is the product of three cultures filtered through particular meshes. Akan through his mother, Ga through his father, and a hybrid of Western cultures through his education. The hunter, or Peimpoku, who is the mouthpiece of the village, can be identified culturally as Akan, but the particularity of hunting shapes his worldview, giving him a unique voice that, unlike an Akan person in the city who may espouse a more exploitative approach to the use of natural resources, can see the environment and its degradations and laments the loss. The particular twist in the conversation that the village in Tale of the Bluebird has with the world is that while they are aware of Western colonialism, indeed very tangibly through the presence of a Kenyan settler, Gawana, they have had no direct contact with colonizers. It was a twist inspired by an article about a community discovered in the Amazon in 2001, which led me to thinking about how that community would now have to inherit the national history of Brazil, into which they had been colonized, when they had never, in fact, encountered the colonizers. So, what do all these conversations do to a crime novel? Well, they alter the nature of the questions that we ask when we read the story. They add nuances that we don't expect. For example, except for wealthy country folk narratives where murder is enacted for financial gain or to gain revenge, most crime novels are set in urban areas because the killer often needs to appear unconnected to the victim, at least initially. What happens then if we know every character that could possibly be connected to the victim? What becomes of the mystery in the murder? The Ananse inspired dialogic and spiritual core of the conversation makes it inevitable that the village bar should be an important axis to tie together past and present, urban and rural, private and public, honorable and shameful. All around the world, the hubbub that emerges when one opens the door of a bar is a familiar sound, punctuated by the slush of liquids, the occasional infectious laugh, and now and then the slap of bodies in conflict. But Akosua Darko's bar is more than that. It is a portal where one slips between folklore and what is happening in the present. It is a metaphorical representation of Sankofa, one of the wisdoms of the Adinkra symbol scribing system of the Akan. Sankofa translates as sang, return, kofa, go and take it, and it is represented either as a bird with its head turned backwards with an egg lodged in its beak, or a stylized geometric sign that looks like a cross between a womb and a heart. In essence, it asserts that we must go back in order to go forward. We must understand the past before we can understand the present. Akosua Darko's bar is where spirit, heartbreak, healing, and abundance huddle, where Opeyipoku's knowledge holds its greatest sway as posturing yields to dialogue in the thrall of potions, where a Western-trained scientist learns that there are versions of life beyond what he has studied. It is Opeyipoku, with his experienced voice of reason, delivered on the page in an English that is derived from transliterated tree, who helps Keo realize that his European scientific approach only teaches him to ask how, but never why. This insight dislodges a hitherto Cartesian axis of inquiry and inserts a new axis that sits closer to the spiritual. The new axis is reflective of a broader cosmology that encompasses both the scientist and the diviner, an axis that expresses the reality of a man who wields the power of life and death as he hunts, yet understands that he is subject to fate, an axis that is expressed in an English lexicon grafted onto the particular experience of an Akan hunter. Indeed, the entire book is a conceptual mirror of the language that welcomes the reader into the novel. Opeyipoku's monologue of observations, history, omens, and humor. In that, It is the manifestation of a quintessential roaring 20s Western entertainment format, the crime novel, transposed onto West African, specifically Akan sensibilities. Within that voicing, the dignity of any existence cannot be questioned, because unlike the chauvinistic approach beloved of normative capitalist shoot-'em-up fiction, the Akan view is that all things have dignity. People, languages, animals. Even a tree cannot be cut down willy-nilly. For that reason, the natural world sits proud in the wings of the story, coming forth to hold court, as with the moment when Openipoku questions Keio's ability to explain deaths. And at the very opening of the story, where a bird leads a woman to a hut that becomes a primary crime scene. Also indicative of the Akan view is the arrival of Gawana, the Kenyan Mau Mau migrant, who is welcomed and whose grandson is referred to as this young Gawana, one of us. The appearance of Gawana is a nod to the constructed space in which the main drama unfolds, a space inspired by the Brazilian first contact story I mentioned earlier, of a people outside the scope of history peddled in schools, where colonial framing of indigenous lives holds no sway. What I like to call an extra-colonial space. In that world, the tools of authority from the colonial and imperialist playbook, such as the police, are robbed of their power because they are not recognized, creating a need for a more discursive approach to crime solving. In the realm of dignity and discourse, we return to Ananse. If your listener or reader has dignity, then you open the channels of discourse, as the hunter does at Akosua Dako's bar, as Keio does after he becomes attuned to the needs of the village of Sonokrom. In that discourse, we can also question the very premise of the crime novel. Has a crime really been committed or not? In Tale of the Bluebird, that question is asked through the mundane, through the steady, uninterrupted everyday lives of its inhabitants, continuing without pause. In this way, the story lives in its community, in the same way that communities can come alive in Ananse stories, in dialogue with the generosity of the teller.